You want a video with more meat? Here you go. Arthur Greenwood opens his case against tariffs with an emotional hook. Tariffs will cost your family $1,000 a year. Scary, personal. It's a classic rhetorical trick that turns abstract policy into a household bill. But here's what he doesn't say. Free trade isn't free. It's just a different kind of cost. One we've been paying for decades in layoffs, overdoses, shuttered schools, and hollowed-out towns. Let's unpack the lie that protectionism is waste, and free trade equals efficiency. That sounds clean on a spreadsheet. But life isn't a spreadsheet. Arthur claims tariffs create artificial barriers, making us less efficient. But what kind of efficiency are we even talking about? Neoliberal efficiency means outsourcing to the lowest bidder. It doesn't matter if that bidder is a dictatorship. It doesn't matter if they use forced labor, ignore pollution, or abuse workers. As long as it's cheap, it's considered efficient. That's not economic brilliance. That's moral outsourcing. You didn't make your iPhone. A kid in Shenzhen did, without OSHA protections, without EPA standards, and without a minimum wage. You paid $799 and called that innovation. Tariffs force a deeper question. What's the true cost of efficiency? What neoliberals call waste, sovereign nations call insurance. Arthur pretends tariffs are just emotional reactions to job loss. That is wrong. Tariffs are civilization's insurance premium. Think about home insurance. You don't buy it because your house is on fire. You buy it because you value keeping your home safe. Tariffs are premiums we pay to preserve vital sectors like steel, semiconductors, energy, food, and medicine. Lose those and your country becomes fragile on purpose. It's not about buying American because it's patriotic. It's about not losing the capacity to build bridges, power tanks, or make our own antibiotics. Arthur says tariffs raise prices. Fine, but what's the cost of a collapsed supply chain? What's the price of war with China when they produce 80% of your antibiotics? Hint, it's more than $1,000 a year. Then comes the economist's favorite phrase, comparative advantage. It means every country should specialize in what it does best and trade for everything else. Sounds nice, but that only works if countries play fair. It assumes everyone values life equally, follows the same labor rules, and respects the environment. That's not how the real world works. China doesn't lead in solar panels because of extra sunlight. They lead because of slave labor, heavy subsidies, and double standards that punish the West but reward authoritarian control. Arthur says tariffs are anti-competitive, but when one side cheats and the other won't defend itself, that isn't trade. That is surrender. He also claims tariffs kill innovation, that without global competition, American firms get lazy and fall behind. There are two problems with that claim. First, Arthur confuses financial pressure with invention. Cutting costs doesn't create breakthroughs. Some of the most important technology in history came from protected and subsidized industries. Nuclear power, semiconductors, aerospace, and the internet. SpaceX would not exist without NASA. TSMC didn't become world-class by chance. They had protection and investment from the government. Second, Arthur thinks innovation means cheaper toasters and faster phones. Real innovation happens upstream. It's energy, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing, and defense. And we've lost much of that to countries that never played by free market rules in the first place. Arthur says, a trade deficit is just when we buy more than we sell. It's not a problem. I have a trade deficit with my gas station. It sounds clever, but it collapses under scrutiny. First, your personal trade with a gas station isn't the same as a nation's trade with another country. You're not a sovereign nation with a currency, economy, or military. When you spend money at a gas station, it stays in your local economy. But when the US runs a trade deficit, money leaves the country, often permanently. That's the difference. Arthur mocks the value of green slips of paper, as if the US dollar is monopoly money. But the dollar is power, influence, and leverage. When we run a trade deficit, foreign governments like China don't just sit on those dollars. They buy US debt, land, companies, and political clout. Arthur jokes about hoarding gold, but China hoards gold lithium, rare earths, and anything that matters in a crisis. A trade deficit means we're exporting wealth and importing dependence. We send dollars and get goods in return. Sounds fine until those goods are vital, and we've lost the capacity to make them ourselves. The pandemic showed how fragile that is. Suddenly, we cared that we didn't make masks, gloves, or basic drugs anymore. Arthur says we're rich enough not to worry about the imbalance, but that assumes our wealth is permanent. It's not. Trade deficits hollow out the industrial base. Once factories close and skills are lost, they don't come back overnight. That's why tariffs aren't about short-term savings. They're about long-term strength. He argues that we get goods in return. So the deficit is fine. But what goods do we get? Cheap plastic, disposable electronics, and low-end textiles. What do we lose? Jobs, factories, and the ability to produce the high-value things that built this country. Over time, the US shifts from a nation of builders to a nation of buyers. That's not innovation, that's decay. Arthur claims trade deficits are harmless. So why do China, Germany, and Japan all run surpluses? Why do rising powers structure their economies to export more than they import? Because they understand that surpluses build capital, jobs, and power. If we depend on other nations for microchips, phones, medicine, and cars, what happens if those nations stop selling to us? Arthur might say that would never happen, but that's naive. In a world of rising tensions, trade dependencies become vulnerabilities, and China doesn't treat trade like a joke. They run huge surpluses, subsidize exports, and dump products below cost to kill American industries. That's not trade, that's economic warfare. And while they play to win, Arthur wants us to keep playing nice. Arthur also mocks buying American, calling it moralistic. But it's not moralism, it's a strategy. Buying American means supporting jobs, tax revenue, labor standards, and a supply chain we can trust. Buying cheap imports might save a few bucks now, but it means funding sweatshops, surveillance states, and lost independence. He claims tariffs force people to buy expensive goods for no reason. But there's a reason. Those goods come with American jobs, American safety laws, and American tax dollars. When you buy American, you support the entire system. Your roads, your police, your schools. Arthur tries to compare international trade to trade between US states. That analogy fails. All states share the same currency, law, labor standards, and safety regulations. China doesn't. Alabama doesn't use child labor or slave wages to undercut Ohio. But China does exactly that to outcompete America. A trade deficit isn't just a number. It only works until the gas station is owned by the CCP and decides it's done selling you fuel. Arthur says, in the long run, free trade creates more jobs. The Rust Belt is healing. People will find better jobs. This isn't just wishful thinking. It's propaganda that's been spoon-fed to Americans, while the foundations of our economy were gutted in broad daylight. Let's tackle the myth that free trade creates more jobs. Arthur leaves out what kind. Since NAFTA and globalist trade deals, we've seen job growth, but not in stable, high-wage industries. Growth has come in temp work, service gigs, retail, and delivery apps. You can't build a life on Uber shifts and side hustles. From 2000 to 2010, the US lost nearly 5 million manufacturing jobs. Entire towns were wiped out, factories shut down, and workers were told to retrain or learn to code. Meanwhile, the same elites offshoring their jobs offered gig apps and antidepressants. That's not healing, that's managed decline. Arthur says free trade makes things cheaper. But cheaper for who? Sure, you save a few bucks on a flat screen. But if your town lost its economic backbone to China, who cares if Walmart shelves are full if no one can afford anything? And cheaper often means morally and materially worse. These goods are made in sweatshops, using child labor, under skies full of industrial smog. When Arthur praises low prices, he's praising a supply chain built on outsourced suffering. He leans on the idea that markets reallocate efficiently, but that assumes transitions are smooth and fair. In reality, skills are destroyed in months. Retraining takes years, and the new jobs often pay less and come with no benefits. A worker laid off in Ohio won't relocate to a tech hub in Seattle just because Arthur says it'll all balance out. Arthur says the Rust Belt is healing, but life expectancy is down, drug abuse is up, and many of these towns are still ghosted by capital flight. The working class isn't healing, it's numbing, and free trade is part of the poison. He paints protectionism as a fantasy, as if we want to end trade entirely. No serious protectionist wants that. We want strategic trade, trade that protects vital industries, uplifts American workers, and doesn't gut entire regions for Wall Street's quarterly profits. Arthur jokes, why not ban trade between states? But states operate under one legal, financial, and labor system. A factory in Pennsylvania and one in Texas play by the same rules. A factory in Ohio competing with one in Shenzhen. That's not fair. That's economic warfare. He says tariffs are taxes. Taxes raise prices. So tariffs raise prices. That's shallow. Tariffs can reshore production, rebuild capacity, and create real jobs. Yes, short-term prices might rise, but so will local wages, supply chain stability, and community resilience. Would you pay $10 more for a tool made in your town, or save $10 while your town collapses? Free trade doesn't make us richer. It inflates GDP at the top while bleeding security from the bottom. It turns citizens into consumers, neighborhoods into warehouses, and sovereign economies into fulfillment centers. Arthur says competition leads to innovation, but when China subsidizes its companies, uses slave labor, ignores environmental rules, and manipulates its currency, that's not competition. That's sabotage, and we're the suckers. Real innovation requires stability. It demands investment in people, not just code. Tariffs don't kill innovation, they protect it. They give our industries room to breathe before they're crushed by race-to-the-bottom imports. And here's the irony. America's tech sector, it was born under protectionism. So were the economies of Japan, Korea, Germany, even our own. The myth that free trade built the middle class is a lie. It was tariffs, investment, and national purpose. So when Arthur says we're healing, ask yourself who got healed. Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the same elites who shipped your job to China and now want applause for telling you to smile about it. Arthur claims competition leads to lower prices, innovation, and more efficient use of resources. Sounds great on paper, but the way he uses the word innovation is like a magic trick. It distracts you from what's actually happening. Here's the reality. Free trade doesn't fuel innovation. It often strangles it. What happens when you open the gates to foreign competitors who don't play fair? Countries like China dump products into our market, not because they're efficient, but because they're propped up by subsidies, currency manipulation, forced labor, and zero environmental laws. That's not natural competition. It's economic warfare. When US companies are forced to compete with slave wages and artificially cheap imports, they don't innovate. They cut R&D. They lay off workers. They offshore just to stay alive. Short-term pressure kills long-term vision. That's not innovation. That's surrender. Arthur praises free markets, but free trade isn't a free market. It's a rig system where only megacorporations win. They have the capital, lobbyists, and global reach to offshore, dodge taxes, and slash costs. Small businesses, family manufacturers, they get crushed. Take semiconductors. We once led the world, then worshipping market efficiency. We let chipmaking move offshore. Taiwan and South Korea protected their industries. We didn't. Now one conflict in the Taiwan Strait could shut down our phones, weapons, and infrastructure. Our solution: tariffs, industrial strategy, rebuilding at home. Innovation thrives under protection, not under predatory trade. Arthur says tariffs reduce competition and make firms lazy. But America's greatest innovations, from Edison to Bell Labs to NASA, happened in protected, government-backed environments, not from being undercut by imports, but from long-term, national investment. Even Silicon Valley, the poster child of innovation, was born on defense contracts, federal grants, and university research. Intel and Apple didn't rise because they were outcompeting sweatshops. They rose because they had a stable base, backed by US investment. Arthur still thinks the global economy is like a farmer's market. Competition always improves quality. But today's economy is a battlefield. And when your rivals cheat, subsidize, and exploit labor, playing fair gets you crushed. He also claims tariffs lead to worse products. That only happens if tariffs are lazy handouts. Smart tariffs are strategic. They buy time, demand results, and guide investment. The point isn't to protect mediocrity. It's to give breathing room, so excellence can grow without being suffocated by slave wage imports. Protectionism isn't anti-competition. It's pro-fair competition. That means laws, standards, and honest currency. Until those exist globally, tariffs are how you defend your people. Arthur calls protectionists collectivist. That's rich. Real collectivism is asking 300 million Americans to accept wage cuts, hollowed towns, and lost industry so billionaires can buy another yacht. Free trade shifts profits up and pain down. Protectionism isn't a fantasy. It's economic self-respect. We used it to build our industrial base. We used it to recover from the Great Depression, and we'll need it again to survive the next global shock. Why are we the only major power told to unilaterally disarm in the name of innovation? China doesn't, Germany doesn't, Japan doesn't. They use tariffs, planning, and national strategy. We're the only ones told to cheer while our economy bleeds. Because hey, cheap blenders, if we want real innovation, we don't need free trade. We need freedom from dependency.
Arthur breezes through one of the most dangerous myths of our modern economy, that trade deficits don't matter. He compares it to buying gas at a station that never buys anything back from him. Cute analogy. Too bad it's nonsense. Here's the truth. A national trade deficit is not a private transaction. It's a systemic leak of industrial power, employment, and geopolitical leverage. Let's unpack it. When America imports more than it exports year after year, that gap has to be filled somehow. And it's not filled with thin air. It's filled with debt, foreign ownership, and the slow auctioning off of our future. The dollars we send out come back as foreign investors buying our land, our companies, our technology, and our political class. That's not prosperity. That's pawn shop economics. Arthur says, we get goods, they get green slips of paper. But those green slips are claims on America's real assets. When you run trade deficits for decades, foreigners don't just take your money. They buy your factories, your farmland, your media, your influence. You're not getting cheap stuff, you're selling your country by the square inch. Let's talk history. From 1776 to the mid-1970s, America rarely ran persistent trade deficits. We became the most powerful industrial nation on Earth through massive export surpluses, tariffs, and manufacturing dominance. But once we embraced the free trade dogma in the 1980s and removed those protections, the deficit exploded. And so did the outsourcing of American jobs, the death of factory towns, and the rise of Chinese industry. Today, we run a $1 trillion trade deficit. That's $1 trillion of productive demand that could have gone to American workers, American suppliers, and American infrastructure, now funneled overseas. That's not a sign of wealth. That's a hemorrhage. Arthur says, trade deficits mean we're rich enough to buy nice things without producing them. No, that's not richness. That's dependency. It's the same logic as someone maxing out their credit cards to flex on Instagram while their house falls apart. It might look nice in the short run until the bill comes due. And don't be fooled by the gas station analogy. That's an individual acting in a decentralized economy. Nations are different. A country with a trade deficit is exporting its industrial base and importing economic fragility. Let's look at how this plays out. Jobs vanish. Every $1 billion in trade deficit costs tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs. Not just low-skill ones either, but the kind that support families, communities, and technical ecosystems. Skills atrophy. When you don't make things, you lose the institutional knowledge to make them. That's why we couldn't build enough ventilators in 2020. That's why we're panicking to relearn chip fabrication today. Debt surges. Foreigners buy our bonds to finance the deficit, trapping us in a cycle where we can't raise interest rates without tanking our own economy. That's not sovereignty, that's being held hostage. China gains leverage, they don't just take our dollars. They use them to buy farmland, invest in U.S. startups, lobby Congress, and influence policy through soft power. Meanwhile, they build up gold reserves, critical minerals, and global infrastructure, all on our dime. Arthur treats the deficit like it's some quirky accounting trick. But the real cost is geopolitical vulnerability. If a conflict breaks out, we can't make our own medicines, electronics, or rare earth minerals. That's not just inefficient, that's suicidal. And here's the kicker. The U.S. is the only major country constantly told to ignore its trade deficit. Germany, Japan, China, South Korea, they all run surpluses. Why? Because they understand that national strength flows from production, not just consumption. Arthur tries to mock protectionists with slippery slope arguments. Why not ban trade between states? Why not between cities? But here's the difference. Cities and states share a national legal system, a currency, a labor standard, and a political voice. China doesn't. Mexico doesn't. There's no symmetry. Free trade without aligned rules is not freedom. It's exploitation. Arthur says money has no value in itself. Exactly. It only has value when it's tied to production, and if we don't produce, that money becomes just paper. That's what happened to Britain after World War II, when it clung to free trade dogma while the U.S. rebuilt its industry. Britain declined. America rose. And now we're making the same mistake they did. Protectionism doesn't mean zero trade. It means balanced trade. It means reciprocity, sovereignty, and strategic control over what matters most. Because a country that consumes without producing isn't a superpower. It's a client state.
Arthur calls tariffs a collectivist fantasy and mocks the idea of buying American as if it's some kind of irrational crusade. He laughs at the moral arguments, says it's all just preachy, Puritan, and moralistic. But here's the thing, the real morality isn't in buying cheap junk, it's in defending your nation's right to survive. Buying American isn't a burden, it's a civic act. It's a wartime mindset in a peacetime economy. Because while Arthur wants to sit back and moralize about low prices, the factories are closing, the supply chains are leaving, the neighborhoods are dying, and every great deal at Walmart is another nail in the coffin of our economic sovereignty. He says, "You're going to force me to spend more of my hard-earned money just because it's made in America." Yes, we are. Because that hard-earned money means nothing if your country can't make its own essentials, its own steel, medicine, tools, vehicles, microchips. If you have to beg China to build your economy, you're not a consumer, you're a serf. Let me ask, when did sacrifice for country become a joke? Our grandparents rationed gas, rubber, and sugar during wartime. They planted victory gardens. They turned factories into arsenals of democracy. And we can't even tolerate paying 10% more for a US-made appliance without whining about inefficiency. That's not moral progress, that's decadence. Arthur sees morality as something personal, like he's just a guy making choices at the grocery store. But morality has a national scale, just like patriotism does. You wave a flag on the 4th of July. Good, but that flag doesn't mean anything if your economy is owned by Beijing and your supply chains stretch across oceans you don't control. And let's talk about this fantasy. He pushes that buying foreign is somehow liberating, that cheap imports give us freedom. No, what they give us is dependency. They give us sweatshop labor, hidden behind smiling packaging. They give us hollow jobs and outsourced futures. That's not liberation. That's economic heroin, cheap highs with brutal long-term consequences. Arthur thinks buying American is some outdated nationalistic guilt trip. But here's the truth. It's an act of defense. It's an act of solidarity. It's an act of love. When you buy American, you circulate wealth into your community. You defend against foreign manipulation. You create demand for domestic excellence. And you send a signal that America is not for sale. Arthur says, so what if China gives its companies an unfair advantage? We shouldn't respond with tariffs. Why? Why should Americans play fair in a rigged game? That's not morality, that's masochism. It's not moral to accept a deal that kills your neighbor's job. It's not moral to reward slave labor with your money. It's not moral to abandon your national capacity in the name of cheap electronics. Let's be clear. Buying American is not protectionism out of fear. It's loyalty out of principle. Arthur says tariffs are about fairness, and fairness is for idealists. But this isn't about fairness. It's about survival. It's about not being at the mercy of regimes who don't share your values. It's about walking into the future with tools you built, not scraps you were handed. You know what's truly moral? Keeping a father employed in Toledo, giving a kid in Detroit a shot at an apprenticeship, making sure your country isn't economically blackmailed during a crisis. That's morality with teeth. That's patriotism with cash behind it. Arthur wants a world of free-floating dollars, chasing the cheapest deal. I want a world where every purchase is a vote for your homeland. Every transaction is a declaration. We don't just buy, we build. We don't just consume, we defend. So yeah, buying American might cost more, but the real cost is what happens when we don't. Arthur Greenwood tries to downplay dumping. When foreign producers sell products below cost to wipe out American companies, he calls it rare, he calls it overblown, and he mocks protectionists for sounding like socialists. But here's the truth. Predatory pricing isn't some paranoid conspiracy. It's a foreign policy weapon, and the people who underestimate it are the ones who wake up too late. Let's break this down. Dumping is a strategic move, not an accident, not an occasional blip, but a deliberate economic ambush. Imagine if Coca-Cola could sell every bottle for 5 cents, wipe out every soda brand in the country, and then jack the price to $5 once they had no competition. You wouldn't call that free market. You'd call that a hostile takeover. That's what China does, and Arthur knows it. The CCP doesn't care about profit in the short term. Their state-backed companies are tools of foreign leverage. They'll burn billions selling underpriced steel, microchips, solar panels, potassium permanganate, whatever it takes to gut American production. Why? Because industry is powerful, and they're in this for dominance, not discounts. Arthur tries to brush this off with a dumb analogy. Walmart does this too. Should we ban them? Okay, let's follow that logic. Walmart crushing mom-and-pop stores is tragic, but Walmart is still subject to US law. China isn't. Walmart doesn't fly spy balloons over our infrastructure. Walmart didn't steal our F-35 blueprints. Walmart doesn't have ambitions to annex Taiwan. So no, your little town's megastore isn't the same thing as a hostile foreign regime, destabilizing global prices to gain strategic superiority. He says, unless half of all foreign trade ends in predatory pricing, it's not worth worrying about. What kind of logic is that? That's like saying, unless half of your neighbors are arsonists, don't worry if someone's stockpiling gasoline. One industry collapse is too many. Ask the American solar panel manufacturers who watched their entire sector vanish in under 5 years because China flooded the market with cheap exports, then jacked the prices back up once the competition was dead. And don't forget the potassium permanganate example. Arthur tries to use this to own the protectionists, claiming that when the US blocked Chinese imports, prices went up. But he misses the point entirely. That's not a failure of protectionism. That's a symptom of letting the foreign cartel dominate the supply in the first place. You wouldn't need to panic buy overpriced domestic chemicals if we had never outsourced our chemical industry to adversaries who could cut off the tap. You don't blame the firewall for the fire. You blame the arsonist. The whole dumping argument comes down to this. Arthur believes the market should remain pure, even if that means letting your rivals undercut you into oblivion. He's so committed to abstract ideals that he's blind to concrete threats. That's not economics, that's ideology. Protectionism isn't about saving weak companies from competition. It's about saving strong nations from sabotage. You don't let your rival build your navy's steel. You don't let your geopolitical opponent become your only supplier of medicine. You don't allow yourself to become addicted to your enemy's generosity. Because dumping is the first move in economic colonization. It's the smile before the knife. And if we don't draw a line, if we don't protect the base of our supply chain from being hollowed out, we don't get to whine when we're left with nothing but import dependency and inflated costs we can't control. Arthur's mistake is simple. He confuses cheap with safe. But sometimes a cheap offer is bait. Sometimes the best deal is the one you don't take. Because real freedom isn't found in Amazon's "Buy Now" button. It's found in the ability to produce, own, and defend the tools of your own economy. Arthur's final argument is the most seductive and the most dangerous. The more we depend on each other economically, the less likely we are to fight. He even quotes Ludwig von Mises. If the baker and the butcher go to war, they must henceforth bake and butcher for themselves. Nice idea. It's also completely wrong. Because history doesn't run on polite theory, it runs on power. And trade doesn't stop war. It funds it. Let's rewind. World War I broke out in 1914, after decades of deep trade ties between Britain and Germany. German steel, British coal, French luxury goods. Europe was more economically interconnected than ever before. Did it stop the war? No. It made the war bloodier. They had more industrialized supply chains to destroy each other with. Japan and the US were also trading partners before Pearl Harbor. American scrap metal and oil fueled the Japanese military machine, right up until the US cut it off. Then boom, war. And what about Russia and Europe in 2022? Europe depended on Russian gas. Russia depended on European technology and finance. Billions in mutual interest. And then Putin invaded Ukraine anyway, because the logic of power always overrides the logic of trade. Arthur's myth that trade equals peace is a fairy tale. It's the same logic that lets your enemy build your weapons in exchange for cheap smartphones. It's childish. It's suicidal. Here's the truth. Tariffs aren't a threat to peace. Dependency is. When you let foreign powers dominate your critical supply chains, oil, semiconductors, rare earths, fertilizer, energy, you're giving them a button they can press whenever they want. A button that says, obey us or starve. Obey us or freeze. Obey us or lose your ability to function. And if you think that button won't be pressed, you're naive. Arthur says tariffs cause war. No, tariffs prevent war by denying leverage. When America drills its oil, refines its gas, and produces its food, we're unblackmailable. When we manufacture our weapons, we don't need to beg Europe or Asia to restock us. When we make our solar panels, lithium batteries, and microchips, we can say no to blackmail from Beijing. That's not aggression. That's strategic independence. Arthur asks, why would China attack its customers? Because markets are temporary, but power is permanent. Easy, because customers can be replaced. Empires don't care if they lose some sales this quarter. They care if they can dominate the 21st century. He invokes the idea of shared prosperity, but what's shared about it? America buys trillions in foreign goods. We outsource our factories, our skills, and our strategic knowledge. And in return, we get cheap plastic garbage and growing dependency. That's not prosperity. That's erosion. He says tariffs make us poorer. They make us self-reliant. He says protectionism is about fear. It's about control. Because nothing is more dangerous than letting your enemies own your switches, your oil valves, your food imports, your microchip plants, your medicine. When a foreign power can shut off your economy like flipping a light switch, you're not in a peaceful relationship. You're a hostage. Peace through trade. Maybe in a utopia. But in the real world, peace comes from strength. Strength comes from production. And production starts with protection. Arthur opens his video chanting, "Tariff, tariff, tariff," like it's a plague, some economic contagion corrupting the purity of the market. But here's what he misses. Tariffs were there at the birth of this country. One of the very first acts George Washington signed, on July 4th, 1789, was a protective tariff. Right after we declared political independence, we declared economic independence. Not with treaties, not with trade deals, but with tariffs. Because the founders weren't naive. They knew that free trade with empires like Britain meant staying a colony in everything but name. They sell, we buy. They manufacture, we farm. And they dominate. Alexander Hamilton understood this deeply. In his report on manufactures, he warned that any nation dependent on foreign production was at the mercy of foreign policy. In plain terms, if you can't produce, you're not free. You're fragile. And he didn't stop at words. Hamilton designed America's early industrial policy, protective tariffs to shield infant industries and build real capacity. And it worked. From the 1790s to the Civil War, America grew into a manufacturing powerhouse behind a wall of tariffs. Arthur mocks tariffs as inefficient. Maybe they are short-term. But let's be honest, what's more wasteful? Paying 15% more for something made in Pittsburgh, or sacrificing entire cities like Detroit, Youngstown, and Baltimore just to save a few bucks on TVs from Shenzhen. Real waste is when your economy looks efficient on paper, but your people are jobless, your factories are gone, and you can't make basic medicine during a pandemic because some Harvard spreadsheet said outsourcing was smart. Arthur asks, are we willing to accept that inefficiency just to protect jobs? The answer is yes. Because we're not just protecting jobs, we're protecting industrial skill, strategic depth, national resilience. You can't build a steel mill overnight. You can't reteach generations of workers how to weld, cast, machine, and assemble complex systems. That capacity, once lost, doesn't come back easily, if it ever comes back at all. Arthur tries to frame protectionism as isolationism. That's a lie. Protectionism is not about closing doors, it's about securing your home. You don't lock your house at night because you hate your neighbors. You do it because you value what's inside. And here's the real kicker. Every dominant economy in history used protectionism to rise. Britain, Navigation Acts. America, tariffs from 1789 to World War II. Germany under Bismarck. Japan's post-war miracle. China. That's their entire strategy. No country ever became a manufacturing giant by outsourcing everything. Even Adam Smith, the patron saint of free markets, made exceptions when national security was at stake. And in the 21st century, economic independence is national security. Arthur thinks tariffs are outdated. But what's outdated is the fantasy of a frictionless global market where everyone plays fair. Tariffs aren't protectionism for its own sake. They're economic self-respect. They're what built America the first time. And they're exactly what we need to rebuild it again. If you made it this far, you already know the truth. America didn't fall behind because we couldn't compete. We fell behind because we were sold out by elites who worshipped cheap imports, Wall Street spreadsheets, and hollow efficiency over strength, sovereignty, and survival. But we don't have to stay down. We can rebuild. We can retool. We can bring back the factories, the trades, the pride in making something real, something ours. Start with what you buy. Buy American when you can. Choose the tool, the shirt, the car made by your neighbor, not your rival. It's not always the cheapest, but freedom never is. Call your reps. Demand tariffs. Demand reshoring. Demand a government that puts our industries and our people first. And don't let anyone shame you for it. Not the think tanks. Not the pundits. Not the Arthur Greenwoods of the world. They had their turn. Now it's ours. Because this isn't just about economics. It's about who gets to define America, the producers or the parasites. Choose the producers. Choose America. And to quote President Donald Trump,
now, historically, when you win the presidency, the person that wins, the party that wins, does poorly in what they call the midterms. And the reason is, I guess, you take it easy a little bit, right? Something happens. I guess it's 93, 94% of the time. This is over a long period of time. I don't know what you get. You know what it is? You get complacent. We cannot be complacent. We got to go out, right? We got to go out. We got to go out and we got to fight like hell, and we got to win the House, and we got to win the Senate.